The morning sun barely broke through the thick clouds hanging over Cedar Valley when Ben Rogers climbed into his old pickup truck. His boots were worn, his jeans had seen better days, and his weathered hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual. 3 years had passed since he'd lost his beloved wife to cancer, and every morning still felt like climbing a mountain he wasn't sure he could handle. Ben's ranch sat on the outskirts of town, a place that once buzzed with life and laughter. Now it felt empty and cold. The fence posts needed fixing, the barn door hung crooked on its hinges, and weeds grew where his wife once planted beautiful flowers. He'd been putting off the repairs for months, maybe years. Time seemed to blur together when you lived alone with nothing but memories. Today was different, though. Today he had to face people. The town was holding its annual charity auction, and Ben owed money to several local businesses. His feed bill at Murphy's store had piled up, and Doc Williams hadn't been paid for treating his sick cattle last spring. Pride was a luxury he couldn't afford anymore. The town square was already busy. When Ben arrived, folding chairs were arranged in neat rows facing a small wooden platform where Charlie Henderson, the local auctioneer, was setting up his microphone. People chatted in small groups, sipping coffee from paper cups and eyeing the items displayed. On long tables, there were handmade quilts, farm equipment, livestock, and various household goods donated by families cleaning out their attics. Ben parked his truck at the far end of the lot, away from the crowd. He wasn't much for socializing these days. People meant well, but their pitying looks and awkward attempts at conversation only reminded him of what he'd lost. He grabbed his worn cowboy hat from the passenger seat and walked toward the auction. Keeping his head down, the first few items went quickly. A rocking chair sold for $50, some old farming tools went for $30, and a beautiful quilt made by the church ladies brought in $200. Ben watched from the back, calculating in his head what he might need to bid on. He needed a new plow blade and maybe some chicken wire if the price was right. Then something happened that made his blood run cold. Charlie cleared his throat and picked up a piece of paper from his podium. "Now, folks, we have something a bit different today," he announced, his usually cheerful voice dropping to a more serious tone. "As you all know, old Mrs. Patterson passed away last month. God rest her soul. She left behind her ward a young lady named Lucy, who's been under her care since she was a child." Ben felt his stomach twist. He knew where this was heading, and he didn't like it one bit. "Lucy is 19 years old," Charlie continued, avoiding eye contact with the crowd. "She's blind, has been since birth, but she's a hard worker, Mrs. Patterson left some debts behind, medical bills mainly, and Lucy needs someone to take responsibility for her care. In exchange, she provides domestic services, cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing." An uncomfortable murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people shifted in their seats, others whispered to their neighbors. This wasn't the usual charity auction. Fair, and everyone knew it. Ben's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He'd heard about these arrangements before, back in his grandfather's time, but he never thought he'd see one in his own town. It felt wrong, deeply wrong, to be auctioning off a human being's life like she was a piece of farm equipment. "The starting bid is $100, Charlie announced reluctantly. For a moment, nobody moved. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Long, then a hand went up near the front. "100, called out Jake Morrison, a man Ben knew and despised. Jake owned a small farm on the other side of town and had a reputation for being rough with his workers. Stories circulated about how he treated the migrant laborers who worked his fields during harvest season. Ben had seen the bruises on some of those men when they came into town for supplies. Another hand shot up. "150, said Pete Walsh, another local farmer. Pete wasn't as bad as Jake, but Ben knew he was struggling financially. A free housekeeper would solve a lot of problems for him. And Pete wasn't known for his gentle nature. Ben looked around desperately, hoping someone decent would bid, someone who might actually care about the girl's welfare. But the respectable families in town were conspicuously quiet. They had their own housekeepers or didn't need the help. This auction wasn't for them. 200, Jake called out, his voice carrying a note of determination that made Ben's skin crawl. "From where?" He stood. Ben could see the girl for the first time. She sat in a chair near the platform, her hands folded in her lap, her head bowed. She wore a simple blue dress that had seen better days and worn shoes that looked too big for her feet. Her brown hair was pulled back in a neat braid, and even from a distance, Ben could see her shoulders trembling slightly. She was young, probably younger than his own daughter would have been if he and his wife had been blessed with children. The sight of her sitting there, being discussed like property, brought back memories of his wife's fierce sense of justice. She would have been furious about this whole situation. "$250, Pete countered. "$300, Jake shot back immediately. The bidding continued, climbing slowly. With each increase, Ben felt his anger growing. This wasn't right. This wasn't how people should be treated, especially someone so vulnerable. His wife had always said that how a community treated its most helpless members showed its true character. Right now, Cedar Valley was failing that test miserably. "$500, Jake announced confidently. Pete hesitated, then shook his head and sat back down. It seemed Jake would win. Ben thought about walking away. This wasn't his problem. He had enough troubles of his own without taking on someone else's. But as he looked at the frightened girl and then at Jake's satisfied smirk, something inside him snapped. His wife's voice echoed in his memory from 3 years ago, when she was sick and weak but still fighting. "Promise me something?" she had whispered one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset. "Promise me you won't let the world make you hard. There's already too much cruelty out there. Don't add to it." He had promised, but lately, he wondered if he'd kept that promise. He'd become isolated, bitter, focused only on his own pain. Maybe it was time to remember who he used to be. "$600, Ben called out, his voice carrying clearly across the square, heads turned in surprise. People craned their necks to see who had spoken. Ben Rogers hadn't participated in community events for years. Many folks had forgotten he was even there. Jake's confident expression faltered. He turned to glare at Ben, clearly annoyed by this unexpected competition. $650, Jake countered. Ben stepped forward slightly, his decision made. $700. The crowd fell silent. $700 was more money than most people in Cedar Valley saw in months. It was certainly more than anyone expected. To pay for what was essentially a work contract, Jake looked around desperately, but his resources were limited. He shook his head in frustration and sat down hard in his chair. $700 going once? Charlie called out, clearly eager to finish. This uncomfortable business, going twice. Sold to Ben Rogers. As the gavel came down, Ben felt a mixture of panic and determination wash over him. What had he just done? He barely had enough money to keep his own ranch running, and now he'd committed to paying $700 for what exactly? He walked toward the platform in a daze, pulling out his checkbook with shaking hands. The girl, Lucia, raised her head as he approached, and he saw her face clearly for the first time. She was prettier than he'd expected, with delicate features and intelligent eyes that couldn't see him but seemed to sense his presence. Charlie handed him the papers to sign, legal documents that made him responsible for Lucy's care and her inherited debts. As he signed his name, Ben wondered if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life or the first right decision he'd made in 3 years. "Miss," he said quietly to Lucy, his voice gentler than it had been in months. "I'm Ben Rogers. I'll take you home now." Lucy nodded silently, standing on unsteady legs. She reached for a small cloth bag beside her chair, apparently everything she owned in the world. Ben gently took her arm to guide her. Noticing how she flinched slightly at his touch. As they walked toward his truck, Ben could feel the entire town watching them. Some faces showed curiosity, others disapproval, and a few showed something that looked like respect. He helped Lucy into the passenger seat, making sure she was comfortable before walking around to the driver's side, starting the engine. Ben realized his life had just changed completely. He'd been living as a ghost for 3 years, going through the motions of existence without really living. Now he had someone depending on him, someone who needed protection and care. As they drove away from the town square, Ben glanced at Lucy, who sat quietly with her hands clasped in her lap. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, he felt like he might have a purpose again. His wife would have been proud of what he'd done today, even if he wasn't entirely sure why he'd done it himself. The truck ride from town felt like the longest 15 minutes of Ben's life. Lucy sat perfectly still in the passenger seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring straight ahead with those unseeing eyes. The silence between them grew heavier with each mile that passed. Ben kept glancing at her, wondering what she was thinking, what she was expecting from him. He'd acted on pure instinct back at the auction, driven by anger and some buried sense of right and wrong. But now, with this young woman sitting beside him, the reality of what he'd done was sinking in. He had no idea how to take care of another person. He'd been barely taking care of himself for the past 3 years. The truck hit a pothole, and Lucy's small bag slipped from her lap onto the floor. She immediately reached down, searching for it with her hands, a look of panic crossing her face. "It's right there by your feet," Ben said softly, pulling over to the side of the road. "Let me get it for you." Lucy pulled back as he reached across her, pressing herself against the door. "I can manage," she said quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ben sat back, watching as she carefully felt around until she found the bag. Her movements were precise despite her blindness, but he could see her hands shaking. The girl was terrified, and he couldn't blame her. She didn't know him from any other man in that crowd. For all she knew, he might be worse than Jake Morrison. "Listen," Ben said, putting the truck back in gear but not moving yet. "I know you don't know me, and I know this whole situation is scary, but I want you to understand something. I didn't buy you. I bought your freedom from that contract. There's a difference." Lucy turned her head toward his voice, confusion written across her delicate features. "I don't understand." "Mrs. Patterson's debts, the legal papers, all of that, it's my responsibility now. But you're not my property. You're not anyone's property." Ben struggled to find the right words. "I just couldn't stand by and watch Jake Morrison get his hands on you." A single tear rolled down Lucy's cheek. "Everyone says Jake Morrison is a bad man." "He is," Ben confirmed. "And you don't have to worry about him anymore." They sat in silence for a moment before Lucy spoke again, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear her. "What do you want from me then?" The question hit Ben like a punch to the gut. What did he want? He honestly didn't know. "I guess I want you to feel safe," he said finally. "Maybe help around the house if you want to, but only if you want to. And if you decide you'd rather go somewhere else, I'll help you figure that out too." Lucy's eyebrows drew together in confusion. Nobody had ever given her choices before. Mrs. Patterson had been kind enough, but Lucy had always been expected to earn her keep through constant work. The idea that someone might help her without expecting something in return was foreign to her. They reached Ben's ranch as the afternoon sun was starting to dip lower in the sky. The old farmhouse sat at the end of a long dirt driveway, surrounded by fields that had seen better days. Paint was peeling from the wooden siding, and several shutters hung crooked or were missing altogether. It wasn't much to look at, but it was home. Ben helped Lucy out of the truck, offering his arm for support. She hesitated before taking it, her touch light and uncertain. As they walked toward the house, he tried to see it through her other senses. The porch steps creaked under their weight, wind chimes made a soft melody in the breeze, and somewhere in the distance, cattle were lowing in the pasture. "There are 3 steps up to the porch," Ben said, guiding her carefully. "The front door sticks a little, so don't be startled when I have to push it hard." Inside, the house felt cold and empty. Ben hadn't been keeping it up the way his wife used to. Dust covered most surfaces, dishes sat unwashed in the sink, and old newspapers were stacked on the kitchen table. He suddenly felt embarrassed about the state of things. "I'm sorry about the mess," he said, leading Lucy to a chair in the living room. "I haven't had much company lately." Lucy sat down carefully, running her hands over the worn fabric of the armchair. "It smells like coffee and wood smoke," she said. "It's nice." Ben was surprised. Most people would have commented on the dust or the clutter, but Lucy focused on the things that made the place feel like a home. "My wife always kept a pot of coffee on the stove," he said without thinking, then immediately regretted bringing up painful memories. She died? Lucy asked gently. 3 years ago. Cancer. The words still hurt to say. Lucy nodded with understanding. Mrs. Patterson died of cancer too. She took care of me since I was little. I don't remember my real parents. They shared a moment of quiet understanding, two people who had both lost the person they depended on most. Ben realized they might have more in common than he'd first thought. Are you hungry? He asked, changing the subject. I was going to make some supper. I can cook, Lucy offered quickly. I mean, if you want me to, Mrs. Patterson taught me. I'm pretty good at it, even though I can't see. Ben started to say no, that she didn't need to work for her keep, but something in her voice stopped him. She sounded hopeful, like cooking might be something she actually enjoyed rather than a chore. If you'd like to, that would be nice, he said. But first, let me show you where you'll be staying. He led her down the short hallway to what had been his wife's sewing room. That morning, after making his decision to go to the auction, he'd hastily moved the sewing machine and cleared out space for a bed. It wasn't much, but it had a window that faced the garden and got good morning light. This was Linda's sewing room, he explained, using his wife's name for the first time in months. I put a bed in here for you. There's a dresser for your clothes, and the bathroom is just across the hall. Lucy stepped into the room carefully, her hands trailing along the walls to get a sense of the space. She found the bed and sat down on the edge, testing the mattress. It's perfect, she said, and Ben could tell she meant it. I'll let you get settled, he said, starting to leave. Take your time, Mr. Rogers. Lucy called out as he reached the doorway. Just Ben is fine. Ben, she said, trying out his name. Thank you. I know you didn't have to do what you did today. I know $700 is a lot of money. Ben felt his throat tighten. It was the right thing to do. After he left her alone, Ben went to the kitchen and tried to tidy up a bit. He washed the dishes that had been sitting in the sink and cleared the newspapers from the table. Through the thin walls, he could hear Lucy moving around in her room. Unpacking her few possessions, about an hour later, she appeared in the kitchen doorway. She'd changed into a different dress, a simple green one that brought out her eyes, and had rebraided her hair. She looked younger somehow, less frightened than she had at the auction. Could you show me around the kitchen? She asked. If I'm going to cook, I need to know where everything is. Ben spent the next hour walking her through every cabinet and drawer, describing where he kept the pots and pans, the dishes, and the food. Lucy had an amazing memory, asking him to repeat things only once before she seemed to have the layout memorized. The stove is gas, he explained, so be careful with the burners. This knob controls the front left, this one the front right. Lucy listened intently, occasionally reaching out to touch things as he described them. Her fingers were graceful and sure, and Ben found himself fascinated by how she navigated the world through touch and sound. I think I can manage, she said when he'd finished the tour. Would you like me to make dinner now? Only if you want to, Ben reminded her. Lucy smiled, and it was the first genuine smile he'd seen from her all day. I want to. Cooking makes me feel useful. As she began moving around the kitchen with surprising confidence, finding ingredients and starting to prepare a meal, Ben sat at the table and watched in amazement. She cracked eggs without spilling a drop, seasoned food by smell and taste, and moved from stove to counter with the grace of someone who had learned to cook by necessity rather than choice. The house began to fill with wonderful smells for the first time in 3 years. Ben found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't since his wife died. Having another person in the house, hearing someone else moving around, making normal household sounds, it made the place feel alive again. Ben? Lucy said as she stirred something. On the stove. Can I ask you something? Sure. Why did you really bid on me today? I mean, the real reason? Ben thought about it for a long moment. I guess because my wife would have wanted me to. She always said that good people don't stand by and watch bad things happen if they can help it. Lucy nodded slowly. She sounds like she was a good person. The best, Ben agreed, as they sat down to eat the first proper meal Ben had enjoyed. In months he realized that maybe, just maybe, this arrangement might work out for both of them. Lucy needed a safe place to call home, and he needed a reason to start living again instead of just existing. Neither of them knew that by morning, the whole town would be talking about what Ben Rogers had done, and that some of those conversations would lead to serious trouble. Ben woke up the next morning to the sound of Lucy moving around in the kitchen. For a moment, he lay in bed listening to the gentle clatter of dishes and the soft footsteps on the wooden floor. It had been 3 years since he'd heard those kinds of sounds in his house, and it brought back memories both sweet and painful. The smell of fresh coffee and bacon drifted down the hallway, making his stomach growl. He'd gotten used to skipping breakfast or grabbing a stale piece of bread on his way out to check the cattle. Having someone cook a proper meal felt like a luxury he'd forgotten existed. He dressed quickly and walked to the kitchen, where Lucy was standing at the stove, her movements confident and sure. She'd tied her hair back with a simple ribbon and wore the blue dress from yesterday. Somehow, she'd managed to find everything she needed without any help. "Good morning," she said, turning toward the sound of his footsteps. "I hope you don't mind that I started breakfast. I'm used to getting up early." "Mind? This is the best thing that's happened to me in years," Ben said, settling into his chair at the kitchen table. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in months," Lucy admitted, bringing him a plate of eggs and bacon. "That bed is so comfortable, and the room is quiet. At Mrs. Patterson's house, I slept in the attic, and the roof made noises all night when the wind blew." Ben watched her navigate the kitchen with ease, pouring coffee without spilling a drop and moving around obstacles like she'd lived there for years instead of one night. "You're amazing at this," he said. "I would have burned the bacon and probably set the kitchen on fire." Lucy laughed, a sound that filled the empty spaces in the old house. "Practice. When you can't see, you learn to pay attention to sounds and smells. Bacon sizzles differently when it's ready to flip." They ate breakfast together in comfortable silence, the morning sun streaming through the kitchen window. Ben found himself stealing glances at Lucy, still amazed by how naturally she'd settled into his home. For the first time in 3 years, the house felt alive again. After breakfast, Ben showed Lucy around the outside of the property. He guided her along the path to the chicken coop, describing the layout of the barn and the pastures where his cattle grazed. Lucy listened carefully, asking questions about the animals and the work he did to keep the ranch running. "It sounds like a lot of work for one person," she observed as they walked back toward the house. "It is," Ben admitted. "I've been letting things slide since Linda died. She used to help with everything, the books, the planning, even helping with the cattle when needed." "Maybe I could help with the books," Lucy offered. "Mrs. Patterson taught me numbers and writing. I know I can't see, but if you read me the figures, I'm good at keeping track of things in my head." Ben was about to respond when he heard the rumble of engines coming up his driveway. He looked toward the road and felt his stomach drop. A line of pickup trucks and cars was approaching his house, dust clouds rising behind them. Even from a distance, he could see the grim faces of the people inside. "What is it?" Lucy asked, sensing his sudden tension. "Company," Ben said grimly. "And I don't think they're here for a friendly visit." The vehicles pulled up in front of the house, forming a semicircle around the front yard. Ben counted at least 15 trucks and cars with more people than he'd seen in one place since his wife's funeral. But these weren't mourners coming to pay respects. These were angry neighbors, and he could see some of them carrying tools that looked more like weapons. Jake Morrison climbed out of the lead truck, his face red with anger. Behind him came other men from town: Pete Walsh, the blacksmith Tom Bradley, even old Mr. Henderson who ran the general store. Ben recognized most of them, people he'd known for years, but their expressions were hard and unfriendly. Martha Collins, the town's biggest gossip, emerged from one of the cars. She was a woman who made it her business to know everyone else's business, and she had a talent for turning small problems into big ones. Her sharp eyes immediately focused on Lucy, who had moved closer to Ben's side. "Stay behind me," Ben murmured to Lucy. Stepping protectively in front of her, Jake Morrison walked forward, his chest puffed out like a rooster looking for a fight. "Rogers," he called out. "We need to talk." "And then talk," Ben replied, his voice steady but his hand moving instinctively to rest on Lucy's shoulder. "But keep it civil, you're on my property." "Civil?" Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. "There's nothing civil about what you did yesterday. The whole town's talking about it." Martha Collins pushed forward, her voice shrill with outrage. "How could you, Ben Rogers? That poor girl is just a child, and you bought her like she was a piece of livestock." "It's disgusting," added Pete Walsh. "We all know what kind of man buys a woman at auction. Especially a helpless blind girl who can't fight back." Ben felt his temper rising, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't we?" Jake sneered. "You've been living alone out here for 3 years, talking to nobody, doing nothing but feeling sorry for yourself. Then suddenly you show up at the auction and spend $700 on a young woman. What are we supposed to think?" More voices joined in, accusations flying from the crowd. Ben heard words like shameful and taking advantage and worse things that made his blood boil. Behind him, he could feel Lucy trembling, her small hand gripping the back of his shirt. "We're here to take the girl somewhere safe," announced Tom Bradley, the blacksmith. He was a big man with arms like tree trunks, and his presence made the threat more serious. "She doesn't belong here with you." "She belongs wherever she chooses to be," Ben shot back. "And last I checked, this was still America, where a man's home is his castle." "Not when there's evil happening inside it," Martha declared. "We won't stand by and let you hurt that innocent child." The crowd murmured in agreement, their anger feeding off each other. Ben could see that reason wasn't going to work here. These people had already made up their minds about what kind of man he was and what he'd done. The truth didn't matter to them. "Lucy!" Jake called out, trying to look around Ben. "You don't have to be afraid. We're here to help you. This man can't force you to stay here." Lucy's grip on Ben's shirt tightened, but she didn't respond. "She's probably too scared to speak," Martha said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Lord knows what he's threatened to do to her if she tries to leave." "That's enough," Ben said, his voice rising. "You people don't know anything about this situation. You're jumping to conclusions based on gossip and assumptions." "Are we?" Jake stepped closer, his face inches from Ben's. "Then explain it to us. Explain why a man who hasn't spoken to another human being in 3 years suddenly decides to spend his life savings on a blind girl young enough to be his daughter." The accusation hung in the air like a poison cloud. Ben could see the ugly suspicion in every face around him. These people, some of whom he'd known since childhood, had already decided he was guilty of terrible things. Nothing he said would change their minds. "You want to know why?" Ben's voice was quiet but dangerous. "Because I couldn't stand watching her go to a man like you, Jake Morrison. Because I remember what it means to do the right thing, even when it's hard." Jake's face turned even redder. "The right thing?" "The right thing would have been to let the church handle it, or find her a proper family to take her in. Not drag her out to your isolated ranch where nobody can hear her scream." That was the final straw. Ben stepped forward, his fists clenched, ready to fight the whole crowd if necessary. But before he could throw the first punch, a clear voice rang out from behind him. "Stop!" Everyone turned to look at Lucy, who had stepped out from behind Ben. Her chin was raised, and despite her blindness, she seemed to be looking directly at the crowd. Her voice was stronger than Ben had ever heard it. "You're all wrong," she said, her words carrying clearly across the yard. "Every single one of you." The crowd fell silent, surprised by her sudden boldness. Even Jake Morrison took a step back. Lucy walked forward until she was standing beside Ben, her small frame seeming to grow larger with each word she spoke. "You want to know what happened yesterday? You want to know why Ben Rogers bid on me?" She turned her head toward where Jake's voice had come from. "He saved me from you, Jake Morrison, and from all the rest of you who stood there and watched while a human being was sold like cattle, and did nothing to stop it." The silence that followed was deafening. Ben could see shame beginning to creep into some faces, while others remained stubbornly angry. "You think you're here to rescue me?" Lucy continued, her voice gaining strength. "Where were you yesterday when I needed rescuing? Where were any of you when Mrs. Patterson died and left me with nothing? You were all content to let someone else deal with the problem, as long as it wasn't your responsibility. Martha Collins sputtered, trying to interrupt, but Lucy wasn't finished. This man, she said, reaching out to take Ben's arm, gave me something. None of you ever did. He gave me a choice. He told me I could leave any time I wanted, that I didn't owe him anything. When's the last time any of you treated me like a person instead of a burden? The crowd was beginning to shift uncomfortably, the righteous anger deflating like a punctured balloon. But Jake Morrison wasn't ready to give up. Lucy stood perfectly still for a moment, her unseeing eyes seeming to look right through Jake Morrison. The entire crowd waited in tense silence, unsure what this young blind woman could possibly say or do to prove anything. Ben felt his heart pounding as he watched her, amazed by her sudden courage but worried about what she might reveal. You want proof that Ben Rogers is a good man? Lucy said, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. Then let me tell you what really happened. Yesterday, and what happened after. She turned slightly, addressing the whole crowd now rather than just Jake. When Ben won that auction, I was terrified. Not because of him, but because I didn't know him. I'd heard stories about men who might bid on something like that, and none of those stories ended well for girls like me. Martha Collins shifted uncomfortably, her sharp features softening slightly as she listened. The ride to his house was the longest 15 minutes of my life, Lucy continued. I sat in that truck expecting the worst. I'd heard what men sometimes do to women they think they own. I was shaking so hard I could barely breathe. Ben remembered that truck ride, how frightened she'd seemed, how she'd flinched when he tried to help her with her bag. He'd known she was scared, but hearing her describe it now made his chest tight with emotion. But then we got here, Lucy sighed, gesturing toward the house behind her. And you know what this terrible man did to me? He showed me to a clean, comfortable room. Not some shed or basement, but a real room with a real bed and a window that gets morning sunlight. She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. He told me it had been his wife's sewing room, his wife who died 3 years ago. He gave me the room where his beloved wife used to spend her time because he wanted me to feel safe. Several people in the crowd exchanged glances. This wasn't the story they'd expected to hear. Then he did something even more shocking, Lucy said, her voice growing stronger. He told me I wasn't his property. He said he'd bought my freedom, not me. He said if I wanted to leave and go somewhere else, he'd help me figure out how to do it. Jake Morrison snorted. Anyone can say words. What proof do you have? Lucy reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a piece of paper. It was wrinkled and slightly burned around the edges. This, she said, holding it up. This is the contract that was signed yesterday. The legal document that made me responsible for Mrs. Patterson's debts and bound me to whoever bought it. Ben recognized the paper immediately. It was the contract he'd signed at the auction, the one that had made Lucy legally his responsibility. Ben Rogers burned this contract in his fireplace last night, Lucy announced. I heard him do it. I smelled the paper burning. He destroyed the only legal document that bound me to him. A murmur ran through the crowd. Burning a legal contract was serious business. If Ben had really done that, it meant he'd given up any legal claim to Lucy's services or presence. Why would he do that if he had evil intentions? Lucy asked the crowd. Why would he destroy the only thing that guaranteed I'd stay here and work for him? Tom Bradley, the blacksmith, scratched his head in confusion. That doesn't make sense. Why spend $700 just to tear up the contract? Because, Lucy said, turning toward the sound of his voice, he's a good man who did a good thing for the right reasons. Not because he wanted to hurt me, but because he wanted to protect me. She folded the burned contract carefully and put it back in her pocket. But that's not all. You want to know what else this terrible man did to me? The crowd waited, hanging on her every word. He spent an hour last night showing me around his kitchen, explaining where everything was so I could cook if I wanted to. Not because he expected me to, but because I told him I enjoyed cooking and it made me feel useful. Lucy's voice grew warmer as she spoke. He was patient with me, explaining everything twice when I asked, making sure I understood where the dangerous things were so I wouldn't get hurt. When's the last time any of you took an hour out of your day to help someone learn something new? Ben watched the faces in the crowd, seeing doubt creep into their expressions. The anger was still there, but it was mixed with confusion now. This morning, Lucy continued, I woke up in the most comfortable bed I've slept in since I was a child. I made breakfast because I wanted to, not because I was forced to. And when I offered to help Ben with his ranch books, you know what he said? She paused for effect. He said only if I wanted to. Everything with him is only if you want to. When's the last time someone gave me choices instead of orders? Martha. Collins spoke up, her voice less sharp than before. But dear, you're so young and you're blind. How can you be sure you're safe here alone with him? Lucy turned toward Martha's voice and her expression grew serious. Mrs. Collins, you've known me since I was a little girl. In all those years, how many times did you invite me to your house for dinner? How many times did you ask if I needed anything, or if I was happy living in Mrs. Patterson's attic? Martha's face flushed red. She opened her mouth to respond then, closed it again. I'll tell you how many times, Lucy continued. None, not once. But yesterday, a man who'd never spoken to me before spent $700 he probably couldn't afford just to keep me safe from someone he thought might hurt me. The crowd was getting quieter now, the righteous anger draining away and being replaced by something that looked like shame. And you, Jake Morrison, Lucy said, turning toward him. You're angry because you lost the auction. You're angry because you wanted me to cook and clean for you, and now you can't have that. Don't pretend this is about my safety. This is about your wounded pride. Jake's face went from red to purple. Now you listen here, girl. No, you listen, Lucy interrupted, her voice cutting through his bluster like a knife. I know exactly what kind of man you are, Jake Morrison. I've heard the stories about how you treat the workers on your farm. I've seen the bruises on the men who work for you when they come to town for supplies. She took a step toward him and, even though she couldn't see, Jake actually took a step back. You think I don't know why you bid on me yesterday? You think I don't know what you planned to do once you got me to your farm, away from town where nobody could see or hear what happened? The crowd was dead silent now. Everyone knew the stories about Jake Morrison, but nobody had ever confronted him about them so directly. Ben Rogers saved me from you, Lucy said simply. And instead of thanking him, you brought a mob to his house, to accuse him of the very things you would have done if you'd won that auction. Dr. Peterson, the town physician, stepped forward from the back of the crowd. He was an older man, respected by everyone, and his voice carried weight when he spoke. Lucy, he said gently, these are serious accusations you're making. Are you certain about what you're saying? Lucy turned toward his voice, and her expression softened slightly. Dr. Peterson had always been kind to her. One of the few people in town who treated her like a person instead of a burden. Dr. Peterson, you delivered me when I was born. You've taken care of me when I was sick. You know me better than most people here. Do you think I would lie about something this important? The old doctor studied her face for a long moment, then looked at Ben, then back at the crowd. No, he said. Finally, I don't think you would lie about this. And I think we all owe Ben Rogers an apology. Apology? Jake sputtered. For what? For looking out for the girls' welfare? For jumping to conclusions, Dr. Peterson replied firmly. For assuming the worst about a man we've known for years, based on nothing but gossip and suspicion. He walked over to Ben, extending his hand. Ben, I'm sorry. We should have known better. Ben shook his hand, still too stunned by Lucy's defense of him to speak coherently. More people began stepping forward, offering apologies and handshakes. Not everyone. Jake Morrison and a few others retreated to their vehicles, muttering angrily. But enough to show that the tide had turned. I think we've all learned something today, Dr. Peterson announced to the remaining crowd. About making assumptions and about judging people before we know the facts. As people began to disperse, heading back to their vehicles, Ben finally found his voice. Lucy, he said quietly, you didn't have to do that. You didn't have to defend me. Lucy turned toward him, and for the first time since he'd known her, she smiled a truly happy smile. "Yes, I did," she said, "because you defended me first. Yesterday, when nobody else would." Ben felt something inside his chest that he hadn't felt in 3 years. Hope. For the first time since his wife died, he felt like maybe there was still some good left in the world after all. As the last of the vehicles drove away, kicking up dust clouds in the afternoon sun, Ben and Lucy stood together on the porch. The storm had passed, but Ben had a feeling that bigger changes were still coming to their quiet corner of Cedar Valley. The weeks following that dramatic confrontation brought changes to Cedar Valley that nobody had expected. Word spread quickly about what had really happened at Ben's ranch, and the town seemed to wake up from a long sleep of indifference. People who had ignored Lucy for years suddenly remembered her existence. Though their newfound attention made her uncomfortable at first, Ben found himself dealing with a steady stream of visitors. Some came to apologize properly, bringing homemade pies and offers to help with ranch work. Others came out of curiosity, wanting to see for themselves how the arrangement between Ben and Lucy was working out. A few, like Dr. Peterson, came because they genuinely cared and wanted to make sure everything was truly all right. "I don't like being the center of attention," Lucy confided to Ben one evening as they sat on the front porch after another day of unexpected guests. "People look at me differently now, like I'm some kind of hero or something. I just told the truth." Ben rocked slowly in his chair, listening to the evening sounds of the ranch. "You did more than tell the truth," he said. "You stood up to a mob when you could have stayed quiet and let them take you away. That took real courage." Lucy was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the arm of her chair. "I was scared," she admitted. "My heart was beating so fast I thought it might burst. But I couldn't let them think those terrible things about you. Not when you've been so kind to me." The evening routine had become precious to both of them. After dinner, they would sit on the porch and talk about their day, sharing stories about their past lives and making plans for the future. Ben found himself looking forward to these conversations more than anything else. One morning, about 3 weeks after the confrontation, Dr. Peterson arrived with a surprise visitor. The older man climbed out of his familiar truck, but the woman who got out of the passenger side was a stranger. She was middle-aged with kind eyes and carried a black medical bag. "Ben, Lucy," Dr. Peterson called out as they approached from the garden where Lucy had been helping Ben plant vegetables. "I'd like you to meet Dr. Catherine Wilson. She's a specialist from the city who's been working with new treatments for certain types of blindness." Lucy tensed at Ben's side. She'd heard promises about treatments before, and they always led to disappointment. "I've been blind since birth," she said cautiously. "Several doctors have told me nothing can be done." Dr. Wilson smiled warmly. "I'd like to examine you if you're willing. There have been some advances in recent years. Not every case can be helped, but some can be, particularly when the blindness is caused by certain types of cataracts or other conditions that can be corrected surgically." Ben felt Lucy's hand find his arm, gripping it tightly. "What do you think?" she asked him quietly. "I think it can't hurt to let her take a look," Ben said gently. "But whatever she finds, it doesn't change anything between us. You're perfect. Just the way you are." The examination took place in Ben's living room, with Dr. Wilson using several small instruments she'd brought from the city. She looked into Lucy's eyes with a bright light, asked questions about her vision, and performed various tests while Ben and Dr. Peterson waited anxiously nearby. Finally, Dr. Wilson sat back with a smile. "I have good news," she announced. "Lucy, your blindness appears to be caused by congenital cataracts. They're clouding your natural lenses, but the structures behind them seem to be healthy. There's a very good chance that surgery could restore at least partial vision to one or both eyes." Lucy went very still. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "I'd want to do more tests at the hospital in the city to be certain, but yes, I'm quite confident. The procedure isn't without risks, and I can't promise perfect vision, but there's an excellent chance you could see well enough to read, to see faces, to navigate without assistance." Ben watched Lucy's face, seeing emotions flicker across it. Too quickly to identify? Joy, fear, hope, and something that might have been terror all mixed together. I need to think about it, Lucy said finally. Dr. Wilson nodded understandingly. Of course, this is a big decision. Take all the time you need. When you're ready, Dr. Peterson can bring you to the city for the preliminary tests. After the doctors left, Lucy was unusually quiet. She went about her usual tasks, helping with lunch, tending to the small herb garden she'd started, organizing Ben's paperwork, but Ben could tell her mind was elsewhere. That evening on the porch, she finally spoke about what was troubling her. What if it doesn't work? She asked. What if I go through the surgery and wake up still blind, but now with painful eyes and medical bills we can't afford? Ben reached over and took her hand. Then we'll deal with it together, just like we deal with everything else. But what if it does work? Lucy continued, her voice smaller now. What if I can see, and I realize that this life, this arrangement between us, was just something I accepted because I didn't think I had other choices? Ben felt his heart skip. He hadn't considered that possibility. What if Lucy's gratitude and growing affection for him were just products of her limited options? What if, with sight restored, she would want to leave and build a different life? Then you'll have choices, he said quietly, though the words hurt to speak. Real choices. And whatever you decide, I'll support you. Lucy turned toward his voice, tears streaming down her cheeks. You would do that? Even if it meant losing me? Lucy, Ben said, his voice rough with emotion. I care about you too much to want to keep you somewhere you don't want to be. If having your sight back means you leave, then I'll help you pack and wish you well. Your happiness matters more to me than my own. She was quiet for a long time, and Ben wondered if he'd said too much, revealed feelings he should have kept hidden. 2 months ago, I thought my life was over, Lucy said finally. Mrs. Patterson was dead. I had no money, no family, no prospects. I was going to be sold to the highest bidder like a piece of farm equipment. Then you saved me. She paused, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. You gave me a home when I had nowhere to go. You treated me with respect when others saw me as a burden. You protected me when I couldn't protect myself. And now you're willing to help me possibly leave you because you think it might make me happy. Ben waited, afraid to speak. I want the surgery, Lucy said firmly. Not because I want to leave, but because I want to stay by choice instead of necessity. I want to be able to look at your face and see the kindness I felt in your actions. I want to see this ranch that's become my home, and the garden we planted together, and the sunrise from our kitchen window. Ben felt his throat tighten with emotion. Our kitchen window? Lucy smiled, the first truly radiant smile he'd seen from her since the doctor's visit. Our kitchen, our garden, our home. If you'll have me not as someone you rescued, but as someone who chooses to be here. Lucy, Ben said, standing up and pulling her gently to her feet, I'd be honored. 3 months later, Lucy emerged from surgery with bandages over both eyes. The waiting was agony for Ben, who spent every moment at her bedside in the city hospital. When Dr. Wilson finally removed the bandages, Lucy blinked slowly in the bright room. Her eyes adjusting to sight for the first time in her life, the first thing she saw clearly was Ben's face, weathered and worried, but full of love and hope. The second thing she saw was her own hand in his, their fingers intertwined. It's more beautiful than I imagined, she whispered, looking around the room in wonder. What is? Ben asked. Everything, Lucy said, her eyes coming back to rest on his face. But especially this. She squeezed his hand, and Ben knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The frightened girl from the auction was gone, replaced by a strong woman who had chosen her own path. And the broken widower who had bought her freedom had found something he thought he'd lost forever, a reason to believe in tomorrow. A year later, on a sunny spring morning, Ben and Lucy were married in a small ceremony in the town square. The same people who had once stormed his ranch with pitchforks now threw rice and cheered as the couple kissed. Dr. Peterson performed the ceremony, and even Martha Collins wept happy tears as they danced their first dance as husband and wife. Lucy looked up at Ben with eyes that sparkled with joy and mischief. Do you ever regret spending that $700? she asked. Ben spun her around gently, then pulled her close. Best investment I ever made, he said. Though I think I got a lot more than I paid for. Lucy laughed, the sound carrying across the square and mixing with the music and celebration. In the distance, their ranch waited for them. A home built not on obligation or necessity, but on choice, respect, and love that had grown from the most unlikely beginning imaginable.